man who jumps out of the aeroplane and builds a parachute on his way down. That's me. You could deal with a murder, you could deal with nothing, you could deal with burglaries, you could deal with some quite comical stuff as well. Running a group of companies is like watching the Tour de France. What is a polymath to me? I think it's a very fortunate person, and professionally they're going to be people that you want in an organization. If your job is something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. So I've spent a third of my life with this idea floating around in the back of my head.
Really?
Yes.
Hello, I'm Dustin, PolyInnovator. Today I'm talking with Luke Brice, a business operations consultant, serial entrepreneur, former police officer, polymath, and business nerd. Thank you for joining me on the Polymath Polycast.
Thank you for having me.
It's a great time to be able to talk about different aspects of life, and I understand that you have a lot of history you want to get into today. What was your mindset 5 years ago, and how have you changed since then?
Yeah, 2019 was actually a pretty pivotal time for me. It links quite nicely with the subject we talk about. I'd not long set up a physical security company. My other sort of previous business was a garden maintenance firm, and the old business in the trades doing domestic gardening services was about as far away from a security company as you could get. And I also was torn between the two. And I loved the old business, but the new one was taking off and was very exciting and sexy and new. So I had to sell that business in a hurry. I was pretty much in transition mode. If I think about how I have lived for 36 years, it's been eternally in transition mode. If I'm not changing who I am from one day to the next, it's a rare thing. I've never been able to sit still in one industry, in one job. So I guess for as long as I can remember, I've been transitioning between identities, juggling plates and in various different sizes and forms and geographical locations. So my mindset's probably pretty similar to back then. The only difference really is that I think I've learned over the years, certainly over the last 5 years, that just because I can do something doesn't mean I necessarily should do it without thinking. The story of the man who jumps out of the aeroplane and builds a parachute on his way down, that's me. I will leap into things at a moment's notice. But I've learned over the last 5 years, I probably do need to slow down. And just because there's something can be done doesn't mean I need to do it.
Yeah, well, and especially the whole today aspect. There's that delayed gratification that's really hard. And I think for polymathic people like us, it's not a shiny object syndrome, I don't think. Maybe it is in some ways, but I think it's more a matter of you see an opportunity, and that's really kind of engaging your mind. You're like, hey, maybe this could work out. Maybe this is what I need to be doing right now.
The opportunity is like my absolute Achilles heel. Opportunity combined with curiosity. Because if I'm presented with an opportunity and I don't immediately think that's a bad idea, what I do is I go to the full other end of the scale. So I go, this is the best idea anyone's ever presented to me. Absolutely nothing could ever go wrong. And effectively, this is my life now. For as long as this can hold my attention, this is what I do. To an extent, I think it's genetic. My dad's very similar to me. He has possibly even a more eclectic career history than I do. He was brought up on a farm in Australia, moved to the UK, and like every Australian who comes to the UK, he ran a pub. He met my mum, who was a nurse. He then became a nurse, left the health service as a geneticist. When he retired, he then went and worked in another pub, drives a school bus, delivers milk, and works in a farm shop as well as building fencing for a fencing contract. So he just does things. So I think it's genetic that we just can't sit still.
I think too, I'm glad you brought up curiosity, because there's that definite trait of polymathic people that curiosity is ingrained into that. But I think that there's also this aspect in a lot of polymathic people, maybe not all of them, but just all of them, or all the ones that we're talking about today, I mean, is that they're opportunists by nature. They see something, they want to do it. And I think that's the difference between like a jack of all trades and a journalist and a polymath, is the one who can really get past the plateaus and get past the boring parts and actually accomplish what they're setting out to achieve and finish it, if you will. Leonardo da Vinci, for example, prime example of just a polymathic person, he had a notorious history of not finishing projects. And I think that's kind of an issue. He managed to finish enough to where he was able to go into ocular science and like laser physics even too and whatnot. He could have done a lot more had he just been able to finish some things and move on to the next one and let it compound rather than just switching too much.
Yeah, I'm definitely guilty of occasionally taking on 10 different projects and only ever completing one. It tends to be the small projects that I don't end up finishing. I'm talking about, take the room I'm in now, this wall behind me. They're not, well, they are real bricks. They're just the front of bricks. The room I'm in used to be a big double garage in the garden, but it's now my office and small pub. small bar that we kind of spend half our life living in. But it was a project that took a long time, and it's for me it illustrates exactly my temperament and my attitude to things I haven't done before, and that sort of polymath idea. I'd never done any kind of building work before, but I figured there's an opportunity to learn, so I went at
Yeah.
it. And over the course, I mean, it took far too long because I wasn't doing it full time. But over the course of 6 months, I sort of built a new room on a whim. Jobs, the small things that I think of at 6 in the morning. That the wouldn't that be a great idea to do that kind of jobs? They don't get finished. My Facebook, for example, is littered with business pages that I've created at certain times of the day where I've thought actually that would be a really good idea. Why don't I just see how it goes? So yeah, so I mean, I've got a tool that I built on Excel for business owners to be able to visually see, am I wasting my time dealing with the nitty gritty parts of running a business? For my CEO salary, would I pay someone that money to deal with the things I'm interested in or in getting involved in a business? And ultimately, the majority of the time, the answer is no. You wouldn't be paying someone the CEO salary to then get involved in petty decisions way down the sort of the pecking order of the business. The point is that tool is theoretically quite a useful thing for people, but it's 80% finished and it's sat in Excel now, and I might come back to it at some point, but because my mind has gone on to something new, and then another project has taken over, which is actually just about 3 feet to my left, that's taken my attention and taken my focus because that's something I'm going to complete, or because I have to, because we're building a chicken pen next door so we can have some chickens. I've committed to doing it, so it'll get completed. But again, it's another thing that I've never done, and
There's definitely this prospect of hyperfixation that a lot of people, I think that yes, hyperfixation is often attributed to neurodivergence, and that's definitely a good correlation. But I think hyperfixation is really for any person. Like it does happen to everybody, just maybe it happens to people who are neurodivergent much more. And one thing I found this channel, I mean, we're talking on the polycast here, we're talking to people who are multidisciplinary. That's the point of this show. But the channel itself is knowledge management for polymaths, organizing your data, your notes, your knowledge. And part of that also includes your endeavors, like your projects.
mhm.
And what I kind of talk about is you have the goals and tasks, then you have your projects that kind of encompass that, but then you have your phases that encompass all three of them. And the phases I think might help you a little bit too, because generally your phases are your focus or area of focus for this time. So whether that is this one career, like let's say like police work, for example, you were focused on that, 80% of your time goes to that, or at least it did during that time. And then 20% might go to some other kind of projects, either one or two. Generally, you might not do more than that. Because, like, what I kind of see is happening 80% on your current focus, 10% keeping the fire lit from a previous focus, and then 10% sowing the seeds for the next one.
Yeah,
And there's other combinations. Like last year, I really needed to work on three things at once. And so I had about 33, 33, 34 split. And I don't normally do that. I don't normally suggest people doing that, even for this channel, people like us, because it does split your attention quite a bit. I think it helped quite a bit as well, though. I might have needed to do that again this year because I had a lot of time wasted last year. The point is understanding what do you need to get done this year and trying to figure out how can you get those small projects into that 20% or even maybe your 80% focus. Maybe you spend an entire year, 80% of your focus is just finishing all the small projects you've done over the years and letting that snowball.
it's hard to tell when something takes our attention. It's hard to tell whether it's just because that thing is shiny, or is it actually genuinely as intriguing and as important as I think it is in that moment. Distraction is for me quite a big thing, because I have a genuine interest in borderline everything, and I can develop an interest in almost everything, and therefore that means I can talk to anyone, well, anyone full stop, about almost anything, which means that opportunities come to me quite often. There's rarely a day. I had a conversation with a friend of mine 2 hours ago, and during that conversation we floated two different ideas past each other for new businesses. They'll never come to fruition. I mean, I'm hoping they won't, because they're pretty bad ideas, but
Oh,
but the fact is that neither of those businesses were, or business ideas were, things that we have ever worked in, either of us. So just that generic interest in things is kind of, it's the start and end of how all of my life changes have ever come about?
I think this was just a good topic to start off with too. So I'm glad you brought it up because I think a lot of people struggle with that, especially in this space of people who are multidisciplinary, these generalists and stuff like that, because we do jump around between different things. And while a lot of people might not understand that you're doing it for a reason and you're actually good, like I think a lot of people who do get things done, they still get kind of labeled as spreading themselves too thin, regardless of which party you are. I can't say, obviously, I just met you, but the thing is, I think that we have it in our minds that, like, okay, I may not get it done now, but I know I'll get it done eventually. And maybe you'll put that phase off to the side for a few years, maybe even of a decade in some cases. And you bring up phase back and you finish it down the line.
It's essential that I do that, that I put things down, because otherwise, if I acted on every idea that I had, I would never get anything finished. And there are certain things, like you said, that I'll likely come back to at a different phase of life. There are certain businesses or life projects or even things around the home that I'll say delegate. I will defer until a later period because it just doesn't feel right. And I'd love to understand how my mind arrives at that decision, because for so many other things it doesn't matter that objectively the right time to do that project or to start that new job or to start that new career idea isn't now, but because I'm so fixated on it, it's happening now.
Yeah.
There's business ideas, and at the beginning of COVID, one of these business ideas I've discussed at length with a friend of mine about starting this company up. And this is an idea that I first had in 2012. So 12 years on, I was a third younger than I am now. I've spent a third of my life with this idea floating around in the back of my head. And because I've thought about it so much, and because I've talked about it so much at length to people, to an extent, I've almost actually done it.
Hmm.
I've thought about the process of how does this part of the business work? How does this part of the business work? To such an extent that were I to start the process tomorrow, hit the button and launch this company, I feel like I'd be ahead of the game to an extent. And that's evident in various other aspects of life. I was putting off contacting some friends this week. I didn't have the headspace to do it. But in my head, I'd sent this message to this group WhatsApp chat.
Because you already thought about it.
Yeah, and so when it came to writing this, I wouldn't say it was an essay, but it was more than just a hey, how are you? When it came to doing it, it took 30 seconds. And I know that sounds insignificant, but the length of message and the wording of the message and the message that I needed to get through to people would otherwise, if I'd not been thinking about it for a week, would have required some kind of refinement and chopping and changing of the wording. So my delay tactics of I'll do it when I think about it occasionally mean that when I do get to a task, it speeds up. And I think that then can occasionally give me a bit of an air of expertise in something. I can approach something which that should have taken more thinking power. Well, the fact is that the thinking power happened over the last couple of weeks,
Yeah.
and I'd almost built that project or built that task in my head a few times before going and doing it, knowing that that was the most efficient way of going about it.
It's like I said earlier about the whole slow burner thing. You're letting it cook over time. I had a project. One of my second brands is Poly Tools, where it's like the polymath toolkit, and it's specifically for creators, but really anybody could use it. And the idea was I wanted to build a website directory of all the tools that I've come across. It's been 2 or 3 years since I came up with the idea, and I wanted to get it done as soon as possible. And I tried building it out using like Airtable, didn't quite work out. Tried using Framer, which is a much more advanced tool. It looked really great, but it performed terribly, and it wasn't very efficient at actually adding tools to it. And eventually, I finally just this last week like remade it again in Ghost CMS. But the thing is, even before I made the first iteration, like a year ago, I still kept thinking about it. I kept thinking about how I want it to look like. I kept looking at all these other tool sites. I'm like, I don't like how they're displaying the tools. I don't like how bland the website design is, that kind of thing. And so I was processing how to create the site. How do I want it to look? How do I want it to feel? And now that I've tried building it a few times, I have more of an understanding of like what can I do? Like what physically can I actually make happen?
Yeah, and you start to think about how all those different pieces of that website or that tool will fit together, and how they'll influence each other. Because if you were to start from scratch without thinking about it for months, if not years beforehand, you would end up stumbling over those issues when it's actually important, or when it's when it's actually in process and will end up affecting it. Whereas by thinking about it months in advance, you've got the opportunity to. There are these buildings that they build now, sort of skyscrapers, big office buildings. There's a couple in London. One called the Cheese Grater because it's just it's shaped like a cheese grater. And what they did is they created a computer program to not only design the building, but to work out what's the most efficient way of us building this. Do we do the normal thing and start by doing the floors, then the shell, then the windows, then the interiors, etc.? Or do we do this order of things? Do we approach it from this direction? Where's the best place, for example, even to have our concrete being delivered from, based on the traffic in London? Because that's no insignificant thing.
No.
So they built it, 1,000 times before they built it. And that same thing happens with the likes of you and I. You've created this tool 1,000 times in your head. And I've written that message to my friends 1,000 times in my head. So when it came to doing it, by and large, we'd kind of already done it. Granted, probably slightly less scientific than the computer designed, but we've had a chance to think through all the different potential stumbling blocks along the way.
Yeah. And I want to mention here too that I'm in agreement with you. It makes me kind of also want to think though, I wonder if this is also perfectionism at point two. Like it's let's say it took you 2 weeks or to make that message and or to finally send that message. But had you just sent it a week into the whole 2 week process, it might have been 85% as good. And would that have been just enough to actually make it worthwhile? And then like you could then move on to the next one. Because there's like a perfectionism issue with polymathic people, especially like Da Vinci, again, bringing him up. He was a perfectionist. He kept adding strokes to like the Mona Lisa even late into his life, like into like his 70s kind of
Mm-hmm.
thing. It was kind of crazy. And the thing is, that comes back because he never thought it was finished. He died before he thought in his head that it was finished. And yet we think it's one of the best pieces ever. And so it's just one of those things where kind of letting go of that perfectionism, I think, is a good trait to have. Having that ability to just let go a little bit. I don't know.
You're talking to one of the world's worst control freaks. Although at times I'm very happy to let something go if it's something that I enjoy. I'm a control freak about it. If it's something that I don't enjoy, even if I think it's important, and even if I think I'm good at it, if I don't enjoy it, someone else can do that. It's There's no logic to it.
I was definitely going to bring up delegating earlier too, because if let's say you have these Facebook page businesses that you could make a landing page for and create a tiny little ecosystem for it, then you could just hand it off to a VA and see what they can do with it and let it roll. Just tell them this is what I want and just check in with them each week, and that way you can delegate it and kind of save time. These interviews, for example, the research phase I enjoy. I go deep. I check out your entire online presence as much as possible. The interviews, I enjoy being here with you and talking to you. The editing, not so much. I'm
There you
decent
go.
at it. Can't be arsed to do it. I just don't want to do it. And so that's one thing I try to delegate when I can.
So yeah, it's interesting you mentioned VAs because 2 weeks ago I was explaining to my parents who are they're not old in the sense that they embrace technology. They have Amazon Alexas in their house and they use WhatsApp and they're fully au fait with the majority of modern technology. But what they're not particularly well acquainted with is modern day jobs. So jobs that didn't exist 20 years ago that rely on some form of technology to enable them to work. 20 years ago, you couldn't have had a VA because you couldn't have a meaningful chat with someone who perhaps lived in a different part of the country or a different country entirely. So the concept of a VA is alien to them. But I was describing a VA that we use in the Philippines.
Mhm.
And having access to modern day technology, if from a VA to the podcast platform we're on now, which means that I can be sat here in the UK at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you can be sat there at 9 a.m. or 10 a.m., whatever you said it was, means that we can do this pretty easily. Now, if this process required actually creating something, or it wouldn't happen. I think I can say quite confidently from my side, but also yours, that if it wasn't easy just to set up a link and create a video, it wouldn't happen.
And as we were saying earlier, it's not really too easy to set up that link
No,
either.
exactly. Yeah.
Come on, podcast, I'll get on it.
Yeah. I've said often, if I was running a business 20 years ago, I don't think I'd be very good at it because modern day tools and modern day access to information, modern day access to instant results is something that I have massively leaned on over the years. And it could be something as simple as I was running a recruitment drive in South London. We had a lot of new projects that were starting with the security company, and we were recruiting heavily for effectively a bank of staff that we could call on at any given moment. So we rented a room in a big office building. We
Mhm.
had maybe 150, 200 different people coming to that recruitment, well, those two recruitment days. And so I live on the south coast of the UK. I'm about an hour and a half from this location in London, and I get about 10 minutes away from this office, and about 20 minutes before 100 people are supposed to turn up. And I suddenly realized that the forms that I'd printed out at home were still sat at home. 10 minutes away from the office, I was able to just save that absolute blunder instantly because I just Googled instantly, where can I get something printed now? I emailed it to
Mhm.
me. Oh, don't tell my ex-colleagues or any other police officers, but I was sat in traffic on my phone, emailing this print company a PDF of these forms. Please, can you print off 300 of these? I'll pick them up in 5 minutes. And I went through, and nobody would have been any the wiser because we live in 20, well, at the time 2020.
Yeah.
I could just do it. So modern technology saves me because of my erratic brain and because of the fact that I was probably having a thought about something that was kind of irrelevant, but it was a nice new thing to think about. It picks up the pieces after me, but it also, you mentioned the term jack of all trades earlier, and I've always hated that term because it means you're the master of none. I know I am never ever going to be stood on stage as the voice in any particular field. I will never be the person who is the oracle in that niche field. I will always be willing to help out with things, and I'll always be willing to engage with any project. But I haven't got a niche. I've got multiple niches. My niche is being, I can't think of the term, but
Polymathic.
yeah,
Oh.
exactly, yeah. Odd, quirky, polymathic, eclectic is probably
Mhm.
the closest thing. But again, what modern day technology enables me to do is have a go. So again, I mentioned the room I'm in.
Mhm.
YouTube. YouTube was how I did everything. 20 years ago, YouTube was about, but it wasn't anywhere near as well stocked with decent videos to watch that I could, even just looking at the video and being able to see this is the point that people have rewound and rewatched the most. Therefore, that's most likely to be what I need. That's kind of the pinch point. That's the important thing. So I could go straight to that part of a 25-minute video and see exactly what I needed. ChatGPT. I work with schools and I help kids in schools develop the idea that they can do something other than follow conventional employment. They can go and work for themselves. They can do something a bit different, kind of life skills as opposed to vocational work skills. And I get home from a meeting with the extended learning leader at one of these schools, and he is a bit wild as well. He kind of has all these ideas, and I get home, and within 25 minutes, I've created job personas for 10 different types of job within the Formula One industry, so that we can apply these jobs to these kids, so that when we run these workshops, they can take the role of the team principal, the driver, the designer, the engineer, all these
Wow.
various different things. So I created a borderline, an entire deck of content within minutes. So modern day technology allows people who are not experts to become multi-potentialites.
Well, and you've mentioned a few different terms as well, and I kind of want to get into that. I actually created a spectrum of all these terms together and basing it off of the level of knowledge you have and how many areas of knowledge you have. I want to go touch on the jack of all trades real quick. A lot of people don't realize that it's only half the quote. Jack of all trades, master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. And so it continues because by having that jack of all trades approach, by having that widespread approach, you have a better understanding holistically of what's going on. When you look at just one narrow trench, it prevents you from seeing over that trench to the trench next to you. By having a jack of all trades approach, it's almost like you have these trenches connected into a nice little tunnel system, or a whole bunch of trees with branches coming together, kind of thing. And the squirrels is the knowledge area, and they're jumping between trees, if you will, or maybe we're the squirrels actually, like eccentric little eclectic squirrels. And so the idea of the multi-potentialite is the potential to do many different things. Well, potential is not the same as actually doing them. And so I always got to have potential light as kind of like the start. Here's the potential to pluripotent potential to do many different things. Then let's say you've done 15 different things, but you've only done about novice level area, then you're kind of a jack of all trades. I definitely know that there's certain cases where people are T-shaped, where they have an actual expertise deeply and they're a jack of all trades. So that's why the T-shaped person is kind of a thing. Then you had the generalist. You kind of narrowed it down to 7 or 5 areas that you really like. You've gotten pretty good at them. You may not be an expert at them, but you're definitely more than a layman. And then you have the polymath, who is like a, I don't want to explain it too much, but you're an expert in a few different areas. And so you are the person on the stage, but you're on 3 different stages.
Yeah, I like that idea. I think by being so broad, you are potentially applying yourself to a large number of different subjects, but never sticking your head so far above the parapet, so far above the trench that you kind of are noticed as being the ultimate haver of knowledge in that field.
Well, you've rebuilt yourself so many different times. What are some of the methods you've done to do that?
Jump out of the airplane and build the parachute on the way down. I mean, it genuinely helped. Sorry, genuinely helps that at each of these times when I've rebuilt, reinvented myself, that it's come almost exclusively at a time where there's some big psychological change, big life change at home. When I left the police and set up at the gardening business, I also moved 40 miles away and I was going through some sort of marriage issues. When I sold the gardening business and set up the security company, I was in the middle of a divorce and again moving house. So all of these things happen at the same time. So it's actually easier, I think, to have lots of different things going on at once, because people talk about, in order to rebuild yourself, you have to break yourself down into minute pieces. I wouldn't say that my experience is particularly extreme like that. I wouldn't say I'd hit rock bottom at those times, but certainly by having seismic shifts in all aspects of life, it enables you to sort of build everything around the new lifestyle, the new business that you're creating, or new iteration of yourself. I think it's very difficult to recreate a big part of your life without adversely affecting something else.
And you mentioned the whole rock bottom part. I think that's a completely logical thought process there, where you're the whole idea of breaking yourself down. People kind of see that and they just kind of continue down. So you kind of get to the point of just it's too much. Really, the whole idea of breaking yourself down and building yourself back up, like let's kind of use exercise as an example. When you break down the muscles, you're not necessarily tearing them. Like if you went rock bottom with muscle tearing, you're literally tearing your muscles or pulling the muscles, you're hurting yourself. But by doing exercise and pushing the muscles, you're making those micro tears in the muscles, which causes them to have to rebuild stronger and get bigger. And because of like the difference between tearing a muscle and just doing the micro tears, which is a natural thing, versus something that's kind of overly not natural, there's that difference of intensity. And I think a lot of people just kind of default to the more intense extreme.
100%. Yeah. If you take your analogy of sort of tearing and ripping the muscles as opposed to the micro tears, in that circumstance, if I was to hit rock bottom, you need to have the ability to actually. I was thinking of Lego, right?
Mhm.
If you break Lego apart, yes, you've broken it into 1,000 Lego pieces, but all of those individual pieces of a Lego still function in their original form. They're just in thousands of pieces as opposed to one cohesive, Concord, whatever you've built this week. So yeah, I think rock bottom is probably the wrong term, but at least
No,
some
I think it's
form.
good.
You like it?
Yeah, I think it was a good example. Then I wasn't disagreeing with you per se. I was just trying to make sure, for the audience's sake, we kind of explain the difference between rock bottom and rebuilding yourself. Because since you've done it so many times too, like you might have hit rock bottom, but you also might have been micro tearing too. You had a lot of different things going on. Each one is kind of tearing you up in some way, and because of that, you became stronger afterwards. There's a quote I really like from the Legend of Korra where it's like, "You are most open to change when you reach your lowest point."
100%. Yeah, there's a guy called Mo Gaudat. He's an engineer by trade. He worked at Google X for a long time. He was their chief business officer for a number of years. Dealt heavily with the creation of their AI side, and his son died pretty unexpectedly, quite young, maybe 18, 20 years old. And he then sort of focused his engineering brain on the science of happiness and what makes people happy, what makes people unhappy. And he kind of came to various different realizations. And because he's an engineer, he distilled them down into very, very simplistic ideas. But as part of his research, he asked, I forget how many people, but he's asked several thousand people since, If I could take away the worst thing that's ever happened to you, but as a result of taking that worst thing away, all the other good things that have happened since that moment, not necessarily as a direct result, but since that moment, that your life path took you past, would you let me take that bad thing away? And 99.9% of people say no. And I fully understand that. If I think about periods of time in my life where I've been at rock bottom, it's I say it's not well documented, but I've made it public. The reason that I left the police, the biggest sort of catalyst for me leaving, was I had a pretty horrendous complaint during the Olympic year of the London Olympics in 2012. And at the time, that was the worst thing that ever happened to me. It sent me down a really dark path. I was having wild thoughts all over the place. Am I going to go to prison for something I didn't do as a police officer? Is my life over? And should I, accelerate that pace of change to life being over? That was, at the time, absolutely the worst thing that ever happened to me. So that kind of broke me down into that rock bottom. That broke me down into those many Lego pieces. But what it did do was it gave me the kick up the rear end to go and find something new. And granted, it was pretty extreme, leaving a very secure public service job, selling my house, using the money from the house to set up a gardening business, something I'd never done before. I'd never worked in a business. I'd never cut grass beyond my own. Kind of wild jump, moved 40, 50 miles away, huge seismic changes that, like I mentioned before. And as a result of that, life's brilliant. Don't get me
Yeah.
wrong, there's things that happen, and every time something bad happens and it's a big one, I have to say to myself, I'll get over this. It seems horrible now, but this isn't the worst thing that's ever happened to me. If it ends up being the worst thing that ever happens to me, it will probably end up being the best thing that's ever happened to me. And it, it's not to say that that means I am quite blasé about things, but it has given me a degree of resilience when bad things happen and when I'm in terrible circumstances or I'm worried about something, to think, is it the end of the world? Probably not. I thought it was the end of the
Mhm.
world when I had that complaint. I've thought it was the end of the world when I was getting divorced. I've thought it was the end of the world when X, Y, Z have happened. But here I am, and I'm on a new path. There's a different one. It will probably lead me to something wild and fantastic. And it means I can get over things pretty quickly these days.
It made you more resilient and gave you perspective.
100%.
One thing it kind of made me think of as well, couple things actually. Stoicism talks about how when this bad thing happens to you, you ask the question, "Can you do anything about it?" Well, yes, then go do it. No, then you have to move on because if there's nothing you can do about it, then there's nothing you can do. Move on.
I wrote it, drew it a few months ago in a situation I was in, and it was, worry. Why worry? Can I do something about the circumstance? Yes. Why worry? Can I do something about the circumstance? No. Well, why worry? It doesn't help. And to an extent, that can make me seem quite dispassionate, unempathetic, because I can approach these situations where someone's feeling, genuinely and understandably feeling worried about a situation. They're nervous, they're upset, and I can come in like a real, just typical bloke, and say, "Can you do anything about it?" No. Then let's just forget, because I've been there and I have the ability to switch off my emotions on that front. Not everyone can, and I find it quite difficult to understand when is the right time to be that stoic, stiff upper lip Englishman, let's move on and crack on with what the situation we've got, versus when to show a bit of empathy.
I think really for ourselves, it's always good to do it for ourselves, and then when it comes to other people, kind of just showing the empathy because you never know what they're thinking, and even if they're stoic themselves, they may be letting the emotions affect them because in that state, you're not going to necessarily be in control of your emotions. So it's interesting to think about. Like that's a good question. That's a good EQ, emotional quotient kind of question to ask. Like, how do you approach that? The other thing I was going to mention too is the Buddhist kind of mindset behind it, because without the lows, you can't appreciate the highs, and so without your deepest low, you won't be able to even achieve the greatest high.
Yeah, and again, that's something I've had to reconcile over the last few years. I've always chased the mega highs. And to an extent, I've largely managed to achieve them in various different ways. Whether it was joining the police and putting myself in extreme situations, those highs were big, but you can't pretend that the highs will come without the mega lows. And some of the lows that happened in the police, not just the situation I mentioned, but situations that I was involved with on behalf of other people, people who had lost children, or horrific things, they hurt, right? I can't go to work as a policeman every day and expect every day to come home buzzing because it's been a really mega high day. They had to come with those lows, and ultimately some of those lows really did outweigh the massive highs. Conversely,
You
if I was to take a role in life or just take a lifestyle which was quite safe and sensible and was
mhm.
borderline never going to experience those lows, to have these very low waves there, I can't reconcile with myself the idea that I'll never have those highs.
Since you've mentioned so many different times about leaving the police force, I wanted to ask you what made you originally want to start with them too.
I'd love to say it was something more profound. There was a TV show that we used to watch as kids called The Bill. It was a cop show. It was like the original cop show in the UK in the 90s. If you mentioned to anyone kind of my age or perhaps a bit older, various different names of the characters. Tony Stamp, for example, he was everyone's favorite. Reg Hollis, he was a bit dopey, but it wasn't a comedy. It was a sort of a drama series. And ultimately, it was watching that. I wanted that life. I loved the idea of good and bad, crime fighting and that sort of thing. But I think subconsciously, I think I loved the idea of doing something different every day, because genuinely you turn up in a police station at whatever time your shift starts. You don't know what you're dealing with that day. You could deal with a murder,
Mhm.
you could deal with nothing, you could deal with burglaries, you could deal with some quite comical stuff as well. The variety that is offered to you as a police officer in any country is wild, and that part of it really did appeal to me. Still does to an extent. The part of what I missed in the first couple of years after I left was that sense of spontaneity, that sense of I need to learn something new here, because in most situations in that job, you, you've never been there before. Yes, you could have been to 100 murders or 100 domestics or 100 shoplifters. They're all slightly different, so you need to approach them differently. So there's always some form of mind engagement. Whereas take the job that I moved to, I was cutting grass, right?
Yeah.
I, I'd go to a customer 20 times a year and cut their grass, and I'd cut it in exactly the same way. The only slight difference is that I might just change the direction of the lawnmower, and that was kind of it. But going back to what we were talking about earlier about the highs and lows, uh, gardening gave me very few highs. Even when I was up in trees, that was about as high as I got. But I had no lows with it. Nothing could
Mhm.
really go wrong to the point that it did in the police. So yeah, I think, like I say, I'd love for it to be a more profound answer, but I like the idea of it. My idols were the cops on the bill. Yeah, and I went for it, and I was probably the only kid from my school that went into that any kind of public service. I went to a pretty, I wouldn't say posh school, but quite a well-to-do school. The majority of the guys that I went to school with all went to university on these sort of vocational courses, and I went straight
Mhm.
into public service because I was different.
You're built different,
Yeah,
as they kids say. What is it like managing a group of companies?
the most exhilarating thing. You talked earlier about the multi potential and having the squirrel jumping from different trees and being a master of 5 or 6 different subjects, and that's what it's like. And I use analogies all the time, and tend to use either sort of biological or engineering analogies. So if you think of a bicycle, working in a business is like looking at the pedal of a bicycle, or just the pedal being your baby. I'm a pedal specialist. I deal with how easily it rotates, how it grips to someone's shoes, for example, or the crank arm, how far away from that central point is it? And that's me, and I can make lots and lots of adjustments which affect this one part of the bicycle. Granted, they'll go on to affect other parts of it. How fast does it move? How comfortable is it, etc. But that's me. That's my job. My job is to deal with the pedal on this bicycle. Running a business is taking that step back and seeing that there's the pedal man there, but there's also the person running the chain. There's the guy running the sprocket. There's the guy running the wheels or the handlebars. And running the business, you can sit back and say, well, actually, the person dealing with that pedal needs to tweak something ever so slightly, because if he's further away from that central point of the pedal,
Right.
it'll go faster, and the chain person will then have to accommodate for that, and the wheel will go faster. So running a business is like stepping back and seeing the bicycle as a whole and being able to influence things, but also seeing how one person's influence changes something somewhere else. Running a group of companies is like watching the Tour de France, because you've got all these different bicycles running alongside next to each other, and occasionally they'll bounce off each other a little bit, but by and large they're all going the same direction. the more people you have in the Tour de France, the more likelihood of someone finishing. Granted, the more likelihood of someone crashing, but that's kind of how it feels. It's you're stepping back even further, and you see these images of someone looking at a small part of a town on Google Earth or Google Maps, and they zoom out, and there you go. There's the US of A instead of Missouri, and then you zoom out even further. You've got the whole of North America, and you zoom out, and you've got the Earth, and it just gives you so much more perspective over everything. And yeah, honestly, it's one of the most exciting things because to an extent, you can pick and choose who you want to be on any given day. If you run a diverse enough group of companies, you can have fingers in pies all over the place. Take Mr. Branson, Richard Branson. He is probably the ultimate multi-potentialite, but he has never, to my knowledge, flown a passenger plane. He's never sung on one of his records that set him up in the early days. He is able to step back and have a real broad view of how all of these different companies provide services, but he's able to put his spin on each of them and apply his essential business knowledge to all of
Right.
them and send them all in the right direction. And honestly, I tend to babble a bit when I talk about these things because I genuinely find it so exciting. It's fun, man, and you are never painted into a corner. And the big thing is, and I think this is a big plus point of being how you and I are
Mhm.
all over the place, is that if you specialize in something, there's always a risk that some tool that we've mentioned before, that some tool will come along to replace you. Even lawyers, if you're a specialist solicitor, you're an expensive asset to a business. To an extent, you can type into a modern form of, the more recent versions of the chatbots like ChatGPT, and they'll give you the same answer that your $400 an hour legal team will.
Mhm.
But by being abstract and having multiple different businesses, you really hedge yourself against all these potential societal environmental changes out there, and just gives you that bit of sort of personal security alongside the fun.
I mentioned earlier the PolyTools channel sub brand I have, and on the newsletter there, I talked about don't put all your eggs in one basket because as a creator, you can't rely on just one platform. You have to be spread yourself out because otherwise, if that platform dies on you, they quit. Like Vine just up and vanished within a day. Essentially, YouTube had Adpocalypse back in like 2019 or something like that, and that ruined a lot of YouTubers' careers because they weren't able to adapt. A lot of TikTokers, for example, too, are putting all their eggs in one basket, and TikTok doesn't really do much for you. You can grow really fast, but that's really the extent of the benefit of TikTok. And so you don't get money, you don't necessarily get conversion to other platforms like YouTube very well. And when it comes to all these different businesses, you mentioned that Tour de France example, and I was thinking about like slipstreaming, about how like if you can go behind another biker, you can use their windbreak to go a little bit faster. And I almost think too with your variety of businesses, if one business is breaking the wind a little bit more, another business can get behind it and kind of use that momentum.
Yeah, it can, and there's two ways that comes about. The first way is there are certain businesses that need a whole bunch of work and a whole bunch of time and cash up front to be able to run. And if you've got another asset, if you've got another company that can loan that business that money and just take away some of that early day risk, that's great. But then there's the other way where they actually complement each other, and by running one business in one sector, it can either use another business, actually buy the services of a business that you run. Take for example, Podcastle, sorry, the platform we're on now. If you set up a business tomorrow which did what this platform does, you use one business to pay for the other one. You've already got your first client, but you've got a service that you pay less for, your new platform, and they work quite well in that sense. One thing I again toyed with the idea of, and will probably happen at some point, when I had the gardening business, I wanted to set up a window cleaning business as well, because it's not the same thing, but in essence, you're providing a similar service to the same customers. You're going to someone's house on a regular basis to do something for them that they either can't or don't want to do,
Mhm.
cutting grass, cleaning windows. And then alongside that came, well, actually, electricians do something very similar, don't they? And so do handymen, and so do painters and decorators. And I had this idea of a kind of a multi-trade group of companies, and I even had a name. It was going to be the Happy Homes Group because, obscurely enough, I set up a dog walking business for my ex-wife, Happy Hounds. It all kind of came together in my head, and I've built this group of companies 25 times in my head. Never happened. But what you said there about how they can slipstream each other, the number of ways that they benefit each other is more than just by being a cash buffer. They can
Mhm.
actually provide not only referrals but services to each other at a cut price. You become self-sufficient. And to take it up to the other extreme, the reason Amazon got so huge and the reason they're as big as they are isn't because they sell more. It's because they actually provide their own delivery. You know, UPS, FedEx, etc., weren't
They
willing.
cut out the middleman.
Yeah, they cut out the
Yeah.
middleman, right? So Mr. Bezos, I'm clearly not comparing myself to him, but he had the same thought process, right? He said, well, actually, I could pass this work on to FedEx, but they're not willing to deliver on Sundays. They're costing us a lot of money. That business is profiting a whole bunch. Well, why don't we do it in house? And then what iterates after that is they then provide the service that they've taken in house. They then sell it outside, not only to themselves but to other clients, and really insulates against any, well, not any, but a lot of external influences. And yeah, I think not only is it exciting, it's probably one of the more advisable business strategies is to hedge your bets a bit and have complementary businesses alongside your own, because whatever you do, some of the most successful businesses in the world, Kodak, for example, well, they're nowhere now because nobody uses film. Had they got
Yeah.
involved in digital processing or digital media, they'd probably be around now. But then,
They actually almost did. They fumbled the bag so bad. If you look at the history of it, they were like on the bleeding edge of digital cameras, and they still failed miserably. Same with Toys R Us too. They didn't hedge their bets against e-commerce, and they actually sold their toys business to Amazon, and failed miserably.
yep.
I was going to mention something. You're kind of talking about having a business ecosystem. So you have that holistic brand, the Happy
Mhm.
Homes group, and then you had all the small brands underneath it. And I talk about something similar with my content ecosystem. I have my PolyInnovator personal brand, and in there I have the Poly Tools, my swimming, my gaming, and other sub brands that kind of all fall under this umbrella or meta niche. I figured you might like that word, meta
Mhm.
niche, because you said you don't have a niche, you have a meta niche. Actually, it seems like. And so this idea of having that group of companies, I think is really good, and maybe you should kind of bring that back. I was talking to someone on the show ages ago, and we were talking about marketing and marketing for the jack of all trades kind of person. So there's a guy in town where I live, and he's a jack of all trades. He literally kind of falls into that branding. I think he even like he has some kind of pun, like he's a Joe of all trades or something like that,
Yeah,
or
I like him.
something like that for his yeah. But the problem is he's not very successful. I mean, he's known, he gets business, he stays in business, but he's not super successful. And I think from what I understand, he's one of the best in town. And ironically, it's coming back to that connotation that the jack of all trades is the master of none, but oftentimes better than a master of one. If you know the second half, it's a positive phrase. If
Hmm.
you only know the first half, it's a negative phrase. And when it comes to marketing, if you say I can do plumbing, electricity, electrical wires, and home improvement and painting and landscaping, you have all these different skills and you may be great at them. You might not just be good, you might be great at them. And you try to market that, people aren't going to believe it. So, let's say you can fix any plumbing issue and any electrical wiring, and then the other person's like, I specifically can fix this part of your sink really well, and someone who needs that part fixed in their sink, they're like, I want to go to that guy because that guy's a specialist or that girl's a specialist. And because they're focusing on that one problem that they have. And so by being the jack of all trades in the branding sense, it makes them seem like, oh, because they're spread so thin, maybe they're not actually that good at plumbing, even though the second person's actually better than the first. And so what I learned was that you should market each of the skills separately, having different funnels for each one. And that's essentially what you were just talking about with the whole home groups, happy homes group.
Happy homes, yeah. There's a lot of people that do specialize in certain parts of an industry, and I'm thinking more in the consultant space. So there are a lot of HR consultants or finance consultants that will kind of aim themselves at a particular industry or sector. So if I know an HR consultant who typically aims herself at legal practices, because while human resources and people law in the UK is applicable across the
Mhm.
board, there are certain nuances and things that tend to come up more so in a legal practice than they would elsewhere. And it's kind of counterintuitive, because if you take human resources consulting, 99% of businesses throughout the UK could use it at some point. Your target market is everyone.
Yeah. Right.
Turn it to legal practices, you've reduced your target market by 99%, which is mad. Why would anyone do that? But then you think, if I'm a legal practice and I'm looking for a support service like human resources consulting, the idea that someone specializes in my industry actually makes that person kind of a no-brainer, because if you consult for all sorts of businesses, yep, you can do those basics, but do you know my industry? Possibly not.
To the idea of just how it appears to the other person, we kind of naturally think ourselves and we kind of stuff ourselves into boxes, and we stuff other people into boxes, and that's how we understand other people. It's how we kind of filter them out. It's like, okay, who is this person? And so, like, what school did they go to? What tribe are they a part of, essentially? And like, oh, are they Ivy League in the US? Little tangent, but it's kind of funny. I heard of a story on TikTok recently where a lot of Ivy League schools, like Harvard kids, they'll come to these job interviews and be like, "Oh, I went to Harvard," and they think that it's such a big deal. I mean, sure, it's a prestigious school.
Mm.
No this to Harvard. I respect it, but to the interviewer, they're like, "What else do you bring to the company?" And the people aren't really able to answer that. Like, well, "I went to Harvard. Isn't that good enough?" And so they mentioned how they brought someone from Australia over to do this to conduct the interview because yes, the person may or may not have heard of Harvard because it's a prestigious school, but there's other Ivy League schools I'm sure they didn't hear of. And basically, that was kind of the premise where it's like, because the Australian person who's doing the interview has no idea what these schools are, that means they don't know what that means essentially to what the interviewer is trying to look for. And so the person who is like, "Oh, I'm from Harvard. I'm a Harvard graduate. I should get the job." And the guy was like, "Mate, I don't know what you're talking about. Like, what else do you bring to the
Yeah, it's not
table?"
relevant to
And
me.
they floundered. Huh?
It's not relevant to them, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't appeal to their sense of excitement.
Well, and the other thing was too, a lot of these people didn't have anything else besides that one box. They didn't, at the very least, they didn't think about it. They might have had other things, but they didn't actually think about, okay, this is the box that I'm selling to everybody, but do I have anything else to sell to?
I wanted to get some storage space at one period of time, and I knew by Googling, the person that owned this storage space was a big fan of the rugby club that is just up the road from me. Like, really, really into it. So I made sure that when I went to look at this storage space, and because I wanted to get a good deal, I thought, I'm going to wear my rugby club t-shirt and talk about these things. And what happened was, when I asked for the discount, he goes, you're a rugby lad. I'll tell you what, I'll give it to you, right? So that that was like my Harvard thing. And had it been
Yeah.
his wife that I'd met up there, or his brother, or whoever, so what, you like rugby? It doesn't matter to me. It's
Mhm.
irrelevant in what we're talking about. So kind of similar. You know, granted, me enjoying rugby isn't me going to Harvard, but it's an example of how, if you paint yourself into that very specific corner, you can really blow yourself out of the water if the stars don't align particularly well for you.
And the other thing is too, it kind of goes back to the empathy thing and understanding who the other person is that you're talking to. Like we talked about that earlier with the whole philosophical aspect. Like, should you be stoic with them or not? Or be more empathetic. And in this case, you were being empathetic. You understood that that person cares about this subject. They care about that box. And so by you kind of code switching and being able to approach yourself to them from that box point of view, it allowed you to connect with that person a lot deeper. And I think that is something that generalists kind of do better at. They're able to adapt to these different boxes and connect with people more easily because you have more boxes to pull from, which means there's more connections that can be made.
Yeah, I'm glad you said I was acting with empathy, because most of the time when I tell that story, I get told I'm acting with manipulation at heart.
Machiavellian kind of thing.
Just sussing out who this person is and what's going to appeal to them. But the fact that, going right back to the beginning, and when we talked about having just a genuine interest in everything, is that it means that I can talk to anyone.
Mhm.
I don't come onto a situation like this talking to you here and worry that you and I won't get on, or that we won't have some kind of common ground. Granted, this is a subject that we clearly have some kind of common ground on. But I remember quite distinctly, one of my first, maybe like 3 months into joining the police, and I was out still with a couple of sort of senior police officers, not senior as in way up, but kind of coaching me, helping the new boy out. And we went and spoke to this guy, and he was quite abrasive at first, and he was quite anti-police. He was, didn't like the fact that we were talking to him. and I spotted that he had an ID card, and it was for a business that I'd worked at a couple of years earlier. I'd worked in the post room, and he had this ID badge for that same place. So all of a sudden, I had one thing that I could start the conversation with, and I said, "Oh, you used to work at, where was it? Irrelevant, some kind of insurance company.
Mm.
You work there?" He said, "Yeah, yeah, yeah." I said, "Have they still got the machines where the tea, coffee, but you can get soup for 10p?" He said, "Yeah, they do. It's really good." And all of a sudden, this guy went from being really closed off to like my mate, and that happens all the time. My partner, she works in a tech business,
Mhm.
and for the most part, the guys that work there and the owners are quite tech focused. I'm not. I can sit and use ChatGPT. I can use tools, but only because
Right.
they're built for modern day people, just to put sort of normal commands in. But I can, to an extent, I can have relatively deep conversations with people about subjects that I've never spoken about before, because I have curiosity about what they're talking about, and I can make an analogy. And I've been described as a chameleon before. I can change that color and go, do you know what? Today I am, in that case before, I'm the guy that used to work at that same insurance company. Or if I was dealing with something far more horrific, I can be that empathetic guy. Or I can put on something far harder, which is like a face of bravery when I'm absolutely, I'm not really not feeling brave. I'm feeling terrified.
Yeah.
But I wouldn't say I'm a good actor. I say I can mold myself to the situation, which has ultimately led me to, by and large, I've had some failures in business and in life, big time. But
Mhm.
for the most part, I like to think I've done okay. It's hard to it's hard to say it without kind of playing myself down, but I think the majority of it is down to being able to be that chameleon and being able to dip my toe in things and not being scared that I won't understand it or I can't pull it off. I think it's a superpower to an extent.
Definitely. And I definitely think it's a polymathic trait too. I think it's a manifestation of your polymathy kind of lifestyle. And another example, just earlier in this talk, for example, you're talking about how you're a police officer in the UK, and I know, for example, that in the US it's 911, but in the UK it's 999, and I only really knew that because I watched like Doctor Who or something like that when I was younger, and I had context of just what the different cultural understanding is. And so by talking to you, I was able to kind of talk in a more way that you would understand better. Because if I said 911, it would take a second for your brain to translate that to 999 and then it'll kind of interrupt the flow of your thought. By me doing it ahead of time, it helps smoothen out the process. And other situations like that, as a host, I feel like it's my kind of my job to do that for the research phase. I may not always do the best job, but I try to do my best with trying to find every little detail. I remember one guest a while back, he didn't have a whole lot of going on certain platforms, but he had a great Instagram. So I scrolled down his Instagram by like many years, and I found one picture of his hero. And I was able to ask him a question about his hero. It was the only place I ever saw out of all his media that he had that was talking about someone he looked up to. And I was able to make that conversation more personable.
It's a superpower, and as long as you use it for the right means. We watched a film a couple of days ago called Hitman, not the one with the bald guy. It's a new one with, I can't remember the actor's name, but he's in Top Gun Maverick, and he plays a guy who is a pretend hitman. So he kind of ropes people in, and when they offer him the money to kill their ex-husband or whatever, he works for the police, and they then come in and swoop in and arrest the person asking him to kill their ex-loved one. But for each one, he does what you've just said there. He researches them, and he becomes the hitman that they want or that they think
Mm.
is real. And firstly, I think the principle is hilarious, because actually your idea of a hitman is very different to my idea of a hitman. So in order to kind of blend that process between phoning the hitman and meeting them and thinking you are exactly what I need, he does exactly what we just talked about there. He appeals to that person's expectations of what the hitman should be. I love the fact that this one actor has played 10 people in one movie. He genuinely has twisted himself into all these different people, and it's perfect. By comparison, Will Smith is Will Smith in every movie. He is the ultimate non-polymath. He every single movie Will Smith is in, he's Will Smith.
And like the opposite could be like Robin Williams, who adapts himself to every role. I guess I'm a hitman because I keep doing all this research. Sorry, I had to make the joke. Something I ask all my guests is, what is a polymath to you?
I would say they're quite a fortunate person. I think they are most likely to achieve some form of personal success. And by that, by personal success, I mean anyone can look at a person and go, they're successful. You hear about lots of people. You mentioned Robin Williams. He was successful, but personally, I don't think he ever felt that way. I think as is evident, he didn't feel particularly successful. I think their ability to adapt, to change their outlook on things, to be resilient, will ultimately lend themselves to future success and a bit of bounce back ability. They know that they've been in situations before and they've gone and tried something different. They know that just because something doesn't work it doesn't mean nothing's going to work. They've got many other strings to their bow. They're not just a one trick the number of little sayings that's coming out of our mouths is beyond what I'm comfortable with, but they're there for a reason. We're not one trick ponies. We are never at risk of being drowned out in a professional sense. We're never at risk of being made redundant in society, because if the world no longer needed Luke the gardener, there's Luke the security business owner, there's Luke the business owner, full stop. There's Luke the consultant.
And the Jedi too.
Yeah, we're related. And 36
I was
years
just saying
old.
you are Luke the Jedi, but
Yeah,
yeah,
do you
yeah.
know, 36 years of being alive, and you're the first person that's made a Star Wars joke. You're not.
Really? Or
No.
no? Oh, okay. I didn't
No.
think so. I was like, really?
Yeah, no, it happens. It happens weekly. What is a polymath to me? I think it's a very fortunate person. I think it's someone who is more often than not going to be quietly confident, will never be stood at the front and center of a situation, will never be stood there saying, look at me, I'm an expert in robotics or whatever. But they are going to be personally people you would like to have around you a lot, and professionally they're going to be people that you want in an organization, because they will be your best employee as long as you don't pen them into that one little section of work.
I think that's a fantastic answer, and the idea too behind fulfillment and feeling like you're successful. Like you said, that they're not going to be saying that they're the best in that area, kind of thing. And I think there's also this issue of imposter syndrome that a lot of polymathic people face, and because they don't necessarily fit themselves into one box, they might actually be great at that box, but because they don't see it as 100% of their time, like a specialist would, or 80% of the time, or something like that, the idea of, am I actually really good at this? And imposter syndrome can really spiral out of control. I think, again, with the late Robin Williams, I think that's kind of what happened there too. Like, obviously, he was a great singer, he was a great impressions, he was a great comedian, great actor. But the thing is, like, maybe because he spread himself so thin, he didn't feel like he accomplished a whole lot. But now there's a whole generation of people, a couple generations of people who grew up with his works and were able to have that inspiration from him.
It is sad, and I don't think anyone could ever look at that situation and not think it's sad. But I do see how it happens. I do see how, when you are good at stuff, that you're never an expert at things, and I'm eternally being reined in by people that I have deep conversations with, where I say, I don't really feel like I've done X, Y, and Z, and they say, dude, look at what you have done. I'm like, yeah,
Yeah.
but I haven't done all of it. I haven't completed it. I haven't achieved. Interestingly, I don't know what it is I'm looking to achieve, but I
Mhm.
haven't reached the pinnacle because I've done 100 different things. I've done a small mountain range. I haven't done Everest.
Maybe you need to spend some time with introspection to figure out, like, what do you want to be your magnum opus? And you probably won't figure it out, but there's a chance you could. And like, I think I have an idea in my head of what I want it to be, but it's one of those things that's going to take a long time. It's going to take a few decades probably for me to even get started. And I was lucky in that sense that I found that out, or at the very least, I think I know what I found it out. What was your fundraising on Just Giving like to achieve?
That was frustrating, in all
Okay.
honesty. At the time, it was okay. So the fundraising, it was just an event, but again, it kind of gives a bit of an insight into my mindset. So I had something of kind of a bit of a breakdown a year, 18 months ago, and it kind of all
Okay.
came to a head in the run up to that fundraising. And the reason I did the fundraising, the reason I did the big walk, was to raise money for a charity in the UK called Mind, deals with mental health issues in the UK, provide support to people. And the walk itself was, well, it was a walk slash run. You could do whatever, but it's around a place called the Isle of Wight, on just off the south coast of the UK, and it is around about 70 miles to do the circumference of the island. And there are options about what you could do. You could do half of it. You could do the first half. You could do the second half. You could do all of it, but have a stay overnight, halfway point, and sleep, and then go and do the second half on day two. Or you could do what I did, which was the whole lot in one go. So,
Love it.
I'm not unfit, but I've never run a marathon. I've never walked a marathon,
Mhm.
or hadn't by this point. So I thought, if I'm going to do something, and this is a very typical thing for me. If I'm going to do something, I'm doing the biggest version of it. I don't want to complete something and think, what if? What if I'd only tried the bigger version? So signed up for it, and I then thought, well, the whole purpose of this is that it's testing me. Can I achieve this thing? And to a certain extent, I genuinely believe that most people can achieve most feats with appropriate training, time, support, help, attention. But I've always wanted to test myself in my own natural abilities and, my state of mind at any given time, or state of body. So I thought, right, I am going to attack this by turning up on the day at 7 o'clock and just going. So I deliberately didn't train for it, because I thought, well, anyone can train for an event. Anyone can train to go for a really long walk. Can I just do these things off the bat? So I did that, which, you know, people have said is mad, but I kind of understand it as it was a test for me. Can I test myself as Luke, the person, as opposed to Luke, the person who's trained for an event? I set a target of £1,000, and in my head I thought, oh, this could be great if I do this, huge feat. It could make some more money for the organisation. I ticked over just past the £1,000 mark, and it was okay. £1,000 doesn't go very far for any organisation. The thing that's made it frustrating is that about 6 months or 5 months ago, I joined someone I know on a walk. It was a 3-day walk that he was doing, and what he was doing was 20 miles each day to get from one football stadium to the next football stadium that his team were playing at, his club were playing at. And because of support he had from the in-house PR team, his distance, which was less than my distance that he did over 3 days, he raised something like £5,000. So he raised 5,000 times as much. Sorry, 5 times as much for doing the same amount, but in 3 days. And it really frustrated me, because I thought, well, I've done more. I've done better things here. So to answer your question, what was it like raising money? Frustrating.
You did a good thing though.
I'd wanted to do a better thing. I wanted to do more because ultimately the distance I walked and the pain I put myself through was what it was. And if I'd raised £200, the pain would have been the same. If I'd raised £200,000, the pain would have been the same. For me, my part of that was the walk. My success in that was the walk. My failure in that was failing to raise more, even though I achieved the target that I set out to. Because what's next is my eternal question.
A lot of different things came to mind to me, and I want to make sure I preface this by saying you did a good job. I don't want to feel like I say anything. I almost feel like your mindset is the opposite of what it should be. Your success is that you made £1,000. You've raised that £1,000 because that adds up every single. That's why there's so many people doing it, because 100 people do that. That's £100,000 right there. And the idea of that you succeeded by doing the walk, yes, you succeeded by pushing your body to a new limit. That's awesome. I'm actually like super envious in a way of that too. Like I want to go ahead and do that too. Like I have that same mindset. I was like, I want to achieve that. But I wonder if the ego came into the idea of like, oh, you want to do it all at once. Because I know exactly that notion. I would have done the exact same thing, I feel like, in that scenario. Like, I legitimately would have been like, no, I might as well just do the whole thing. But I almost wonder if maybe you should have done the 2-day thing, because then you could have rested and taken care of your body more and not had to over exert yourself in a way. Because you succeeded. You did raise money. And when I first saw that page, that was my initial thought, like, oh, 111%. That's awesome. Like my brain didn't think, oh, £1,000 is not that much. I thought, cool, he achieved the goal. He did it. That's awesome. To me, it wouldn't have really mattered whether you took 3 breaks, 1 break, or no breaks. The fact that you did it in general is the point.
I am probably every week I'm told that I'm my own worst enemy and I'm my own biggest critic. I don't think I'll ever not be. Even when you were saying then, yeah, maybe you could have done it in 2 days. I'm sitting there thinking, no, because I could have done
Yeah.
it in one, and I did it in one, and I never want to sell myself short.
Mhm.
I'm annoyed that I didn't do it quicker. There's a term that I learned from actually an ex-employee of mine in the gardening business, very good friend now, not US Marine, ex-Royal Marine. And his attitude is, that'll do, will never do. It's never enough just to kind of just tick over, yes, I've beaten my PB, but could I have beaten it by more? What can I do it next?
Mhm.
And to an extent, we're both set up for failure on that front, because if you're always looking at what's next, you never achieve. Even when you do achieve, It's been and gone. You don't give yourself that time to think, I have achieved this, because there's always the next thing in line. I suspect on my deathbed I'll be sat there thinking, I've achieved some things and I've done okay. I'm hoping that's a long time
Could have
away.
done more.
Yeah, I know, right? What if I'd done more? It's the old thing is that nobody ever wishes they made more money, etc. I do genuinely worry that I think when I get to that point, I will worry or still be thinking, could I have done more? I don't want to feel like that. I'd like to feel some form of accomplishment, but the world's a big place, and I think that I always have this feeling of time's running out.
Yeah.
I
I
could
mean,
I could
it
do
really
another
is
thing.
though.
Yeah, right.
Yeah.
And I need to do more, because one day I won't be here, and I will have missed out on opportunities that I could have enjoyed.
Well, again, I agree with your mindset. So I'm thinking, like, what does that mean entail? I think this conversation that we're having here is important for a lot of people to hear too, because we're talking about the problems of people who are polymathic face and the idea of achieving in life by having the energy expenditure of doing, for example, that race all in one go versus doing it in 2 days. You're indulging into that instant gratification in a way. Like you're like, I want to get it done. I want to have it done. Versus by like letting yourself just have a smaller break. But imagining like if you did 2 days in a row, maybe you would have made 1,200 pounds or something like that. And then your mindset, again, you said 200,000 would have been the same deal because the whole goal to you was to finish it. I kept thinking about my hero Da Vinci, like he's the person I look up to, and he considered himself a failure by the end of his life, from what I can recall studying on him. And despite the fact he achieved so much, in fact, he if his works had been published, he would have advanced medical science by 500 years, essentially. And the idea that he, one of the most like profound humans, like people, one human who did one of the most things in his lifetime, essentially, feels like he was a failure, then like that kind of sets a precedent there. And I don't want that precedent to be the same. That's why I have this show. I want to be able to highlight all the different areas of your life because I want you to feel seen, right? Because you've done many different things. You should be seen for those different things and not be put into just one box. Like, yes, you are Luke Brice, you are that box, but that box has tons of other boxes inside of it. And those boxes should be highlighted as well.
It's something I have thought about a lot. There are so many occasions in life where I think if I was someone else sat next to me, looking at me, saying the things I'm saying, doing the things I'm doing, I would really be able to say, give yourself a break. But I just do as I say, not as I do, right? I can say these things to anyone else. I can say, you've done really well. I think it's one of the few drawbacks with being a polymath is that because you know that you can do things, you always feel like you should. I can do things around the house. And therefore, if I get someone in to paint the wall, I feel like I should have done that.
Yeah. You feel like you should have just done it yourself. Yeah.
Yeah, and don't get me wrong, I paint the walls, but I'm thinking of an example of something that I theoretically could get someone to do.
Again, it comes back down to delegation, instant gratification, being able to understand like you can do it, but should you do it? Like you're saying. One thing you mentioned earlier is the whole macro versus micro concept. I actually even had to write down a blog post idea after you mentioned that. It's like, oh, I can take that angle and roll with it a bit more.
You're
The
welcome.
idea of thank you. I'll show you afterwards. I have a few posts. So it's idea because the looking from the macro point of view, like you just said a moment ago, I could tell myself that you need to slow down, take a break. You've done well. Like you're doing enough. And that view, like you talking to yourself, is talking from that macro point of view. Like that person talking to you is saying, like for me, for example, talking to you right now, I'm seeing your life in the macro. I never was in the micro of you doing it from day to day to day. But because I'm seeing it from the macro, I miss out on that micro view. But I also think that I'm seeing it as a holistic path. And like here's this, that, this. And I think that we could achieve a lot more if we're able to just take a steps back, look from that macro point of view ourselves, and be like, okay, this project I could get done over the weekend. This project also could be done over the next year. And would it matter which one it is? No, I just need to get it done. But by doing it over the course of the year, I could also get 3 other things progressed as well.
It's a concept and a principle that in my most recent line of work, business consulting I'm not sure if I mentioned, but I consult for small and medium businesses where the owner of the business is still kind of the technician. They're still in the weeds of the business. They're still doing the stuff, and they want to be able to become that kind of macro presence. The bicycle example, they're still the man on the pedal, the woman on the pedal. They need to be able to step back and look at the bicycle.
Mhm.
And it's one of the most frustrating things for me when I see someone who is still stuck in the nitty gritty, because it doesn't have to be that way. And it's something that it's one of the few areas of life where I've managed to apply that to myself, that step back sense, because I genuinely do enjoy whatever it is I'm doing far more if I'm not involved in it. I know that sounds really weird, right? But if I am not sat inches away from that piece of work or that project or that job, whatever it is, and I can step back and see the progress as a whole, it's far more enjoyable. And I guess I'd never really thought about it in that sense, in the sense that, practice what you preach occasionally, but transferring that from business and running a company to actually looking at my own life and achievements. And I'll give it a go. Actually, this has probably been one of the best therapy sessions you could ever have experienced. Thank you. We'll trade. You can have that blog
Yes.
post idea, and I'll take this away. The view that I've got ahead of me is my house, and it's a nice house. It's not the nicest house, but it's not a bad house. It was very different to what it is now. But despite the fact that it wasn't as nice as it is now, I loved it. I loved the fact that we bought it. It was ours. It was our first home together.
Mhm.
And then I've done these things to it, and I love it even more. And I'll probably love it a little bit more when I finish the chicken pen next door and I've got 4 little girls clucking away. But I don't often give myself the time to sit and think, oh, I did that. I like this. I like this thing, because I'm always thinking about what can I do to it next. And it's not about what can I have. It's always about what can I do to things. But much like in business, and I'll always say this to clients of ours, just take a step back, have a look at it. Is it working for you? Yeah. And enjoy it, because life and business and all of these things should be fun. I mentioned before, if there's a task that I'm good at but I don't enjoy it, I'm not doing it.
We only have a couple more questions before we end up wrapping up today, but what new hobby have you started this year?
I have learned a lot about chickens this year. There's not a day that goes by where I don't start a new hobby of some form.
Mhm.
I will just find an interest in something. When people ask me about my hobbies, I'm quite boring, because my work is my hobby.
Mhm.
What I do now in terms of helping business owners is something that I've been doing unofficially since I was a teenager. I've always been that kind of outside external point of view to a person's situation, to a person's business, to a person's house, whatever it is, because I just love helping people. I love helping situations, and I guess stepping back and broadly speaking, my profession is making things better or helping things to get better. It doesn't matter what field it's in. I just applying some objectivity to make someone's life easier or better. So applying that very broad concept to things that I've done over the years, that's the one constant. That's the one consistent thing, is that I have just helped. And that's my hobby. My hobby is helping, and making things better. So yeah, I think there's a whole list of hobbies, and uh, when I speak to my kids about my my jobs and businesses, the last time I set a new business, I say, tell a lie, the second to last time I set a new business up, I was talking to my daughter about it. She's 12, and she just sat there, cocked her head at me like this, raised her eyebrows, and said, "Why? Why another one, Dad? Why can't you just do one thing?" I said, "Because I don't want to. I want to do something different." And yeah, it makes people chuckle, but
You're in the right place.
yeah, I know, right?
One thing I will say too is like when I research a guest, I don't really make much of a distinction between hobbies and careers. What I see is okay, that area of expertise, regardless if it's a hobby or a career, how deep are you in it? And then that's about it. Because I don't think there's I don't see a hobby as in like, oh, hobbies low knowledge and careers high knowledge. I see them as okay, personal professional distinction. But either one could be expert level expertise. One of my hobbies is, content creation, although it's kind of also my career at the same time too, like you were saying with your business. And it's like I consider myself a deep expert in content creation because of how much I've learned. But technically speaking, to most people, it'll appear as a hobby.
If your job is something you love, you'll never work a day in your life. Aside from the early days of running a business, where it is kind of a necessity to try and go and get that business and get it off the ground, and there's a bit more, you need to get skin in the game. When it comes to actually running the business, by and large, I'm just lucky that I get paid for something I love. Yes.
How does Blue Light Group help other businesses?
The Blue Light Group I actually sold a couple of years ago.
Okay. I was wrong. I
There you
chose
go.
the wrong call to
Yeah,
action there, not.
you'd have to ask my ex-business partner. When I was running the business with him, we had the security company, which provided manned guarding security guards to shopping centres and building sites around the country. We
Mhm.
also had a facilities management business where we would manage the services provided to sort of large corporate buildings around the UK. We had started a medical support business for events and medical transport, and we also had a small sort of property investment arm. So effectively, again, it was helping, and I guess that's it's kind of a really lazy way of saying it because all businesses help something in some way. We were all about helping corporate clients with larger premises.
Well, that's great, and I appreciate you answering that, even though I got the wrong
It's
thing
okay.
there.
It's only
But
it's only 2 years ago, so there's
yes,
been genuinely, I think, 5 businesses that I've been involved with since then.
right. Well, given how you have a lot to offer, what do you want to be the call to action then to help people?
How do you mean?
So I always kind of leave the last question to be something that is one of your endeavors, and that way you can kind of talk about what you do and give a chance for the audience. Because you came on because we wanted to talk about polymath and talk about your life, and that's the reason why you should come on. I guess you could say on a show like this. But there's also a lot of people who come on these shows who want to show their book or they want to like talk about their business. And since this is not like a business podcast per se, we'll talk about business obviously, but I wanted to give a spot for you to be like, here's what I do and here's what you can find me with and that kind of thing.
Cool. Okay. So, given that the one constant in my career and life has been that of helping people, either imparting my own sort of learned knowledge or more of a consultative coaching style way, I mentioned that I now do what I love and what I've always done as a hobby, and I run a business called the Next Level Business Club,
Mhm.
which it kind of does what it says on the tin. We work with owner operated businesses where the person who owns the business still works within it. They have a hand in the day-to-day operations, and they are, certainly from our point of view, they're too involved in the minutiae of what goes on within the business. And what we help them to do is to take that macro approach.
Mhm.
We help them to organize the things within the business that they should have organized. We help them to start to measure the success or failure or running, or, you know, various parts of the business, so that they can quickly take a snapshot of the business and see, like a dashboard in a car, you can see your oil temperature is perfect, your speed is X, Y, and Z, and your engine revolutions, and you've got this much fuel left. We kind of coached them to a point where they've got that snapshot of their own business, so that, you know, if you're driving your car, you don't want to stop at the side of the motorway to put a stick in to see how much fuel you've got. You want to be able to see it as a snapshot so that you can focus on the important thing, which is driving, looking
Right.
forward through the windscreen, and actually driving the car, and in the same way that we help people to drive their business where they want it to go. Between me and my two business partners, that's something that we've all got in common, is that ability to apply ourselves, even with the same basic set of principles. We can apply ourselves to almost any circumstance, because business, I find it quite easy, those principles of step back and measure these different things. Not everyone else does, and I just get so much joy out of doing that. So yeah, that's what we do. Next Level Business Club, based in the UK. We've got clients all around the world doing all sorts of things, from a personal trainer to an estate agent. I'm working with a lady next week who, wait for this, we talked about niche. This is about as niche as you'll ever get. She is a solicitor by trade. She runs an AI legal chatbot, which is trained specifically at the moment to advise women in Tanzania on their inheritance law.
Hmm.
Never expected that to come out of someone's mouth when I started consulting for businesses, but it just shows the fact that you can have a core principle of things, but you can apply it anywhere. And it comes really
Mhm.
back to what we've been talking about for our entire time here. You don't have to be an expert in all of these things. You can largely just be good at things to be able to help that person with their very specific niche.
And I wanted to also mention too, ChatGPT is a generalist, but I see a lot of companies now coming out like what you just said there, who are making it into a specialist for that niche. And I find that that's really interesting. That's a great example of one.
I'm looking forward to it because it's something I never knew existed, and I'm learning, and I think that's probably a very common thing amongst people in this community is that we just love to learn, and that sort of hyperstimulation of the brain. If you're not learning, you're just dying.
Well, check it out, Next Level Club, and all your different socials. I have links in the description. It's a great call to action. I think a call to growth would be a great moment of just taking a step back and looking at your life in a macro view, like we were talking about earlier.
100%.
This is Luke Brice and Dustin PolyInnovator on the Polymath Podcast. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much.